Here's my story on constructivism. It's about a teacher named Mrs. Silva who wants to implement constructivist teaching strategies into her classroom. She has a 6th grade class, and she wants to help engage and motivate her students to take an active role in their learning process. And in the story, she has her day planned with many interactive teaching strategies that create meaningful context for the students to construct knowledge based on their experiences. So she's really wanting to engage her students in learning, actively engage her students in learning, because she believes that by learning, you create meaning through experience. So for her lesson, she wanted her students to develop a deeper understanding of critical thinking skills when thinking about where a food comes from and what's in it. So she planned activities around students learning about these different ingredients and evaluating and analyzing information they learned from film, research, and reading nutritional labels that they bring in. And then she's going to have them reflect and write an argument about what they learned, persuasive writing. So lots of critical thinking going on. So she begins the lesson by building from prior knowledge and showing the class visual images. She shows them a picture of a cheeseburger next to French fries, next to milkshake, and asks what 3 of these images have in common. Spoiler alert, they all have corn. So the students, she also shows them pictures from the grocery store, all the foods that they're familiar with. So she's building off this prior knowledge. She's drawing from past experiences of these students with these different foods that they see at the grocery store. She's showing them visuals. And all the visuals that she's showing her are foods that contain corn. To work on problem solving, she gives them a list of all the different corn-derived ingredients and poses the question, what kinds of food typically contain these ingredients derived from corn? She designated each table a research group and had them all look at the different labels that they brought in and examine them for any of these corn-derived ingredients. So they're problem solving, they're looking at these different ingredients and trying to find them in the common foods that they eat. And they're trying to figure out why they're all corn but have different hidden weird names. Mrs. Silva also implemented collaboration by having her students work in these groups to determine the most common corn-based ingredients that they found in these labels. So she has them state their findings as a group after completing a nice big visual chart for the class. She also wants to create meaningful context for this activity to emphasize the teaching, providing a real-world setting instead of just simply instruction out of context. And since she couldn't take the students on a field trip to like a corn processing plant, she decided to show them a really great documentary, case-based learning, a clip from a film called Food Inc. on the industrial production of corn. So the students are really, seeing this learning environment like they're there instead of just being taught about it. This collaborative learning involves communication between students and the groups. So she has them communicating a lot and discussing how they felt about the idea that corn is hiding in these foods, often behind different names. And she has them discuss how frequently they read these nutrition labels on the foods they eat and whether or not people have the right to know what's in their food. So after this discussion, she has all the students individually write an argument piece about whether or not people have the right to know what's in their food, supporting their point of view with reasons and information they learn. She has them doing this because she hopes and knows that the students will use this near transfer of knowledge to other classes. She knows that this will not be the last time they write an argument essay. They'll be writing it well into college. So this is a near transfer skill, knowledge that they can transfer to other subjects. Mrs. Silva is starting to think about transfer of learning. And another part of that is implementing explicit teaching so her students can apply what they learn to other parts of their lives. So after they start drafting their argument essay, the teacher has the groups talk about how they could use these persuasive writing skills in the future to possibly convince someone to hire them for a job. All of these students will probably get jobs in high school and have to interview. So these explicit teaching. So the near transfer is harder thing for the students to, knowledge for the students to transfer. So after this group discussion, far transfer. It was finally time for lunch, and the students were hungry after all that critical thinking they did. So Mrs. Silva wanted to implement a far transfer strategy, and so she began to set up her next lesson on percentages. And she really wanted her students to be able to transfer this knowledge of percentages to the real world, to totally different circumstances. For example, being able to determine the discount on a sale, which Mrs. Silva, by the way, did not even really know how to do until later on in life, was not adequately taught, possibly. Mrs. Silva had already worked a lot with her students on fractions and found that using classic analogies and metaphors helped to teach such abstract concepts. So the students are able to work on percentages because they already have this knowledge of fractions. And that's really hard to teach. So she used a classic analogy, a piece of slices, to teach her students. And it was a great visual to help them understand fractions. She had one more transfer of learning strategy up her sleeve. She had a history lesson on the civil rights movement. And after, she asked her students what elements are needed to create a successful social change and human rights movement. Because she knows that generalizing broader principles from a specific situation like the civil rights movement helps them apply their learning from one situation to another. So by having them look at specifically the civil rights movement, she also had our students research other movements and see what they had in common. So to really help them understand. Mrs. Silva is so passionate about everything. She's also passionate about conservation and wanted her students to understand the problems faced by endangered species globally. So she felt like her students needed to actively participate in the learning experience and acquire this knowledge through cooperative education. She decided to partner with the local zoo and have the students fully immersed and physically active in the learning about the endangered animals and what is and the immediate threats surrounding them. She had heard of this situated learning and wanted her students to be actively involved in addressing real-world problems. So she assigned different endangered animals and zookeepers that take care of the animals to different groups. And these groups have to gather information and data on their animals, including what conservation efforts are being done. And they'll later have to write a research paper on it. Mrs. Silva is so happy as she's watching her students' knowledge be acquired situationally, because she knows that they're constructing knowledge from these experiences that they're fully immersed in through this hands-on learning situation. And they're being challenged to use their critical thinking skills because she had them brainstorm questions to ask the zookeepers prior. And they're going to ask them about what they can do to help, and questions about their animals. They're asking them what their duties are. They're helping them in these real world activities. And her students became successful from this social interaction because Mrs. Silva knows that learning is a result of a social process. And it takes place through relationships between people and connecting these experiences with authentic learning. So Mrs. Silva had her students immersed in this social community. The zoo, I would say, is a big community, as well as this global community and their efforts to protect these endangered species. And this was an unintentional learning process of the virtue of stewardship of the planet and the animals. So Mrs. Silva's goal for this field trip was to be a facilitator of learning. What that means is that she wanted to really just guide and assist the students in their learning, because she felt like when students actively learn the experience, they acquire that knowledge. And so by staying on the sidelines and listening and only offering support, advice, and scaffolding when needed, when necessary, the students were forming their own thoughts from the experiences and really actively learning. And that's the end.